It's another Manly Monday, and this Manly Monday, we're talking about, manspreading. Generally, the idea of taking up space and why it got kind of politicized. But the manspreading one is weird because I think it started as something of a joke that went kind of crazy because there's no sense of humor about it. Best I can tell, it started on Tumblr. No surprise. But it really took it really took wings when the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority included it in an ad campaign about respectful behaviors. And the weird thing about this campaign is it also included behaviors like leaning on, the poles people hold on to and putting on makeup. I don't know why putting on makeup bothers anybody, but it included manspreading. Now, what is manspreading? Manspreading is basically the habit of sitting with your legs spread. Now, I do this. You'll see me. I'm like, when I'm talking. Now, part of that is because I have problems with my hips and my knee. And so that's just the most comfortable position. I've adapted to sit sort of like, the hanged man in tarot cards because it's a bit more ladylike. And that's what it comes down to, right? The reason it got so heated is this is gendered behavior. Now, you like this sort of content, kick me a few bucks, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/LeannaK. In part, this topic came up because of Leanna Care sessions, because of discussions I had about permission to take up space that I talked about last week. And I will talk about what I determined based on Friday's video at the end of this video so that people who are just coming for this and don't care about overall channel things, you probably want to, but if you don't, I'll leave it till the end for people who are just watching once because the YouTube algorithm recommended this. The YouTube algorithm never recommends me. So anyway, the idea of manspreading and calling attention to the spread is because it's seen as men's dominance of their environment. The fact that men can take up space and women can't. And that's really where the charge is, right? Because otherwise it's just like any other behavior on transit that involves taking up two seats when it's crowded. Now, COVID, I think, has dampened this a little bit because of social distancing. But there is that idea that men can take up space and women can't. And a lot of guys watching this right now are going, what planet are you on? Right? And that's the challenge with these generalities. It varies from group to group and situation to situation. Obviously somebody is going to be more relaxed in an environment they're more familiar with and they feel like they have more comfort in than in an environment where they feel less comfortable, right? And that is where I think these things fall down. Because whenever you're saying something about men or you're saying something about women, there's going to be a lot of people that don't fit that bill. And I know people who get upset about the whole manspreading thing, even though they don't do it. It's the overall concept of taking up space, right? The other issue is, let's face it, this is quite trivial. And I'll talk about internalization on Wellness Wednesday and how not to sweat the small stuff sort of thing. But I already talked about that in an episode If It's Not Therapy. So I'm going to deep dive into internalization a little bit more. But yeah, this idea that it's gendered and that women don't do equally space expanding things like putting their purse on the seat next to them. I mean, that that has become an issue, especially in the age of laptops, that people need space to put their backpack or their purse or something like that. Because it doesn't if you got a big shopping bag, this happened to me once on transit and I felt very self-conscious. If you got a big shopping bag, there's nowhere to put it, right? You can't, if you sit it on your lap, it's still sticking out. There's no rhyme or reason behind the size of a bus seat or the size of an airplane seat. Somebody just determined that's what it was going to be. And you notice Scouts here, we're going to get cat spreading soon. And so this really is a trivial thing that ended up becoming this huge thing, which is true of so many things that start on Tumblr, but this thing caught up people who aren't even on Tumblr. So let's talk about that taking up space thing. Because a lot of people don't feel like they can take up space now, right? Right. And this is one of those things that is a reality of life. I really think that everybody at some point in their lives has felt like, you know, they just want to shrink down or they need to shrink down so they're not in the way. I talked a few weeks ago about the party I went to, and I was just in the wrong spot no matter where I stood. Bless you, Scout. And there is a certain point where you have to go, well, somebody may talk, shit about me. Somebody may mock me. This is not something I can take up brain cells about. Easier said than done, right? Hence, I'm going to talk about that on Wellness Wednesdays. But it is this thing where, bless you, Scouty, bless you, where especially in, gaming nerd spaces, places like that, not typical men, right? Not typical women either. And so this idea that men take up more space or feel more entitled to take up space hits people wrong in these spaces, not because they do it and see themselves in it, but they think that their identity is being maligned or attacked somehow. And this is an interesting disconnect because there's two types of people, right? The people who are only attributing this behavior to a certain subset of men, and people who think because man's in the title, it's assumed all men do it, right? And I get that every group has their extremely sensitive people now. And there's this feeling that if you don't play that game, you're not going to get any attention. I'm putting that badly, but people feel like they're only allowed to take up space if they're oppressed somehow, when really what all this stuff is, when it's something as trivial as something like manspreading or taking up too much space, it's fairly trivial, right? It's an annoyance. It's an irritation. And I think that the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York, and Seattle did it apparently too. And then Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, D.C. made comments on this. Toronto said no, they weren't going to comment. I think it's interesting that it was a female representative. This was the craziest thing. It was the female representative from the Toronto Transit Commission said, we're not commenting on the manspreading campaign. And she just said, be courteous to each other, make sure the seats are available, right? In some transit, Madrid, apparently, it is actually not allowed to take up more than one seat. It's like, this is one of these things where it's also a sign of our very, very rule-oriented society, right? Because courtesy has gone out the window. And this is why I talk about honor. And one person said to me last week, when you're talking about honor, you're actually talking about integrity. No, this is not. This is where it expands beyond integrity, right? Because it factors in courtesy as well. If you behave with honor, you don't pride yourself on being an asshole. You're courteous when you can, when it takes nothing out of you. And so there don't have to be these stupid rules, because, you know, when it's 2:00 in the morning, actually it's pretty busy on the subway at around 2, because that's last call downtown. But, you know, 1:00 in the morning, midnight, and there's no game or concert letting out, and you're tired and no one's there, and you want to stretch out a little bit, as long as you're not putting your feet on the seat and getting it dirty, though let's face it, transit seats are not exactly clean. But still, if you're not affecting anybody because the car is empty, who cares what you do? It's only when it's crowded, right? And this is also when you get into disabilities that aren't, you know, if somebody doesn't have a cast on their foot and they're like me, they have hip issues. This sort of thing, instead of just sort of, oh, well, you know, if you know somebody doesn't have a problem and they're just sitting like that because, you know, they have no poise, that's one thing. But if you're like me and some days, because I have inflammation in the joint, guess what? The extended position is sometimes the least painful. Not the most comfortable, because nothing's comfortable, but the least painful. And who knows? Maybe there are guys with the same issue. I don't think they have issues from years of ballet. But hey, I could be wrong, right? But that's the thing, you don't know. And there used to be some cultural enforcement above and beyond rules that were just be accommodating, be decent to each other. Yes, I'm aware that a lot of people, Black people in the US, for instance, Indigenous people in residential schools, were not seen as humans, and so they didn't get this consideration from other people. And even now, there are assholes and there are decent people. But it just seems that what we traded for, it's not even a trade, is it? The result of more people being seen as human, fully human. The backlash has been this pride in being an asshole, in just being obnoxious, and nobody being able to tell you otherwise. You know, the whole Donald Trump thing. If you have money, you can be a bore and be an asshole to people and no one can stop you. Yeah, go. He says what we're thinking. No, he doesn't say what I'm thinking. No, he doesn't. And I do think that part of the big difference between countries like Canada, where our civility is slipping, but we're still way ahead of the US. A lot of us are, you know, really aghast at what the opposition political parties are doing right now. You know, it's one thing to paint your opponents in the worst possible light. It's another thing to actually mislead people and attribute to a level of government something that is not in their power. We have this issue where people confuse provincial and federal jurisdiction, and then, you know, the central bank versus the government, all that stuff. And that's American style politics. Americans have had politicians just outright lying to them for years, and it's completely legal. And here it's sort of, you get fined if you really breach the rules badly, but their attitude is, if we win, who cares about the fine? Money well spent. So is it really a deterrent anymore? Maybe at the local level or campaigns that are less flush with cash, but the people who are great with fundraising, money should not be speech. And because it's all about might equals right now, and this is not, I say right, not right wing. All political spectrum does that, does this. But, you know, because if you've got a bunch of people to back you up bullying someone, you can get away with things. And if you don't, you're just a victim. I think that's what's at the core of the whole manspreading tempest in a teapot and why it's so upsetting. It's like, oh God, another thing I have to be hyper aware of. And I mean, just as an empathy exercise, the complaint was not well communicated. But the idea that women have to sit prim and proper and even cross our legs, which is not good for your circulation, to keep your legs closed, right? Symbol. Well, guys are like, oh, it's a symbol of a larger issue, right? And I think that if somebody, if it's left there, if it's a symbol of a larger issue of the whole, keep your legs closed no matter what, ladies, I think everybody could understand that. You know, isn't it interesting that we have this gendered behavior, right? It's the fact that it became this Tumblr thing, right? That anytime something hits on Tumblr, it just becomes toxic. Thank God the Tumblr days are over. Now it's the Reddit days. And the Mumsnet days. Oh, Lord. It's this one kind of group, two groups. There's two particular pockets on the left and the right that just make everybody else miserable, right? It's those particularly mouthy Karens on, and Karen's a gender neutral term, on both sides. They're just wrecking it for everybody else. Nobody can have a conversation because if you get a certain critical mass of those people, then they just take up a lot of space, ironically enough. And that, I think, is what it comes down to, is that the exposure a lot of people has had with this, and people taking pictures of people without their permission, that's invasive, especially if there's any identifying characteristics of the person. Like if you're taking a person of a person's face, that's invasive. Do it for a good reason, right? But the people that are able to write articles about this stuff, and you know, it got to the point that Tom Hanks was photographed taking up 2 seats, and he said, "Hey, internet, idiot, the train was half empty, it's scattered, there was plenty of room." There you go. Tom Hanks, voice of reason. And that's the thing. The people who are taking these pictures, the people who are getting their comments disseminated, when you have a column on a website, you know, when you're a contributor, you take up space. When you have a tweet go viral, that's not a good thing, but it takes up space, right? You exist in the world. I've gotten used to it. I find the whole viral tweet thing incredibly annoying, but it's the reality of our world. But me doing this, I take up space, right? When I do Twitch and anybody bothers to watch, that's taking up space. When I do the radio show, the podcast, It's Not Therapy, that's taking up space, right? And there are a lot of people, and in this case, it's the significant thing is men, who don't take up that much space and are going, for God's sakes, that's just the way I sit. Like Tom Hanks said, if it's empty, who cares, right? Now, the people that insist it's physically painful for men to close their legs, your pants are too tight if that's true, guys. But, there are some drag queens that call bullshit on that. That was a particularly stupid response from a men's rights group. No surprise, those organizations increasingly are doing more harm than good. And I mean, the backlash has been interesting because people are now calling out the spread of manspreading, and it's been a whole thing, right? And the core of it is two very charged words that, when you put them together, might describe the social force of the modern age. Manspreading is this inflection point, this intersection point of entitlement from multiple different viewpoints, like the guys that, when it's crowded. Now, again, it could just be they have no manners. They're not doing it deliberately. They weren't raised right? But there's that. But then the entitlement of the people making a big deal about Tom Hanks on an empty subway car, right? But then there's aggrievement. The aggrievement of people making a big deal about trivialities. The aggrievement of people who are like, oh God, another thing. And aggrieved entitlement never goes anywhere good. Because aggrieved entitlement, the thing that makes the combination of aggrievement and entitlement such a mess is when someone feels entitled and they're aggrieved. They think they can do anything. They give themselves a lot of permission structures for bad behavior to get back the entitlement they think they've lost. And that's really what's at the core of a lot of this stuff, because you don't see workaday people complaining about this stuff, right? You see places like, The Guardian making a big deal of this thing, Tumblr, right? And I think, unfortunately, because when you take what the transit systems did and look at the behaviors that are comparative, like putting on makeup, it's not that big a deal, right? Oh, he's leaning on a pole instead of holding on to it. Not that big a deal, right? Not a huge deal. The problem to me that this underlies is that we don't have commonalities in what we consider courteous, and courtesy isn't nearly common enough anymore. There are too many people, again, who pride themselves on poor behavior. And you guys know me, I'll clap back on anybody who does that, right? It's not just, I said men's rights groups are increasingly doing more harm than good. You know how I feel about TERFs. I like the comments section here to be a place people can come and actually, for the most part, read the comments. Because otherwise, what's the point, right? If we're not modeling good behavior, if we're not creating spaces where this shit doesn't happen, then we're just being aggrieved and waiting for somebody else to solve the problem. And I think a lot of people feel helpless to solve the problem. And again, more on Wellness Wednesday about that. I'm going to do the help support this channel again for people who want to stop. And I'm going to talk about the decision I made about courtesy on this channel and comment spreading. Help support this channel, please. It helps me out a lot. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K. A couple bucks a month. That's all I'm asking for. Or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/Leanna K. That helps out a lot as well. If anybody's interested, most of the subsidized stuff goes to people who do pay something, but they can only afford once a month. They need more than that because, a lot of them are on disability or some other limited income. So it just supplements more sessions, in case anybody was wondering. Okay, so in response to the comments about that comment that people found very disturbing, it was one of those things where there were really strong feelings on all sides. And it was one of these 3 fundamental truths at the exact same time Hamilton thing. For people who missed the video, there were comments very disturbing. They didn't violate any rule about, under the previous definition of attacking other commenters, it didn't violate it. And so I didn't want to do anything until I said something and got feedback, because I promised I wouldn't. Courtesy. See? A couple of creepy comments are not enough to spook other people. And the point was made, and I do agree that someone who makes a statement like they did, comparing sexual abuse of children to trans-affirming medicine, that someone says that knowing it's going to offend someone. And so in many ways, that's an attack on anybody who identifies that way, or someone who cares about somebody in that group. And when it's put that way, that solves the problem. Now, somebody said, give them a warning. If they fight you, kick them, because then that's behavior and not an opinion. And some people would say, yeah, it's still an opinion. It's not, though, right? Because of the construction of it. It's, well, we can't, kids can't consent to sex, so, healthcare for children should be blocked by the government. It's nonsensical. And it's not an opinion of one thing or another thing. It's, I'm going to throw something I know is offensive and horrifying in there and compare something else that I'm suggesting is equally bad in there, right? It is, and this is where I don't think it was intended as a hateful comment, but it was said knowing it was going to bother some people. And because the intent wasn't there, I think is what gave me pause. And I'm not going to be able to catch any comment. There was some debate back and forth whether anybody would think I condoned something in the YouTube comments. I can't do anything about that, especially in heavily commented videos. I can't police all the comments. Some of them I don't even see. I don't know what's going on, especially on my phone. YouTube is hiding some comments from me. I won't be able to see them on my phone. I can see them on my PC. So if I happen to be screening comments on my phone, I may miss things. So there's nothing I can do about that. The idea that I'm endorsing things in a comment section, that goes too far for me. But I think that consideration of others is not too much to ask. And so I'm asking people going forward, please really consider whether horrifying people and creeping them out and not angering them, disturbing them. Child abuse is disturbing. I don't care if you think it's actually child abuse. It's something society considers over the line. Really consider whether your point is worth that, because I am going to treat that going forward as an attack. If That's what I've decided I'm going to do. I'm going to give warnings so that people know if I see them. Some will slip through, but that's what I feel comfortable doing. Everybody deserves to take up space, and I'm trying to find a balance, balancing people's right to dignity and unpopular views. And I do see a difference between an unpopular view and something that just people know it's going to upset people. There's an inherent, you're saying it to upset people, or you're saying knowing it's going to upset people. And that's a deliberate act. Please consider that in your comments going forward, right? Because the only way everybody can be allowed to occupy space and take up space and, get the same, entitled to equal amount of space so somebody isn't spreading out into other people's spaces is to have that consideration where it's not just about your angry typing, right? It's about other people's ability to go about their day without seeing something really, really disturbing. And trolls are going to troll, but in this case, I don't think it was a troll. Okay. Thanks for watching Manly Mondays. Have an honorable week.